sermon is entitled The Power of Love. The power of love, because you cannot be able to reach out to people unless you have the love of God in your heart and unless you truly love people. And we want to just be able to look at that now. Just taking you back very quickly, First Kings chapter 7, last Sunday, we looked at this story of the 4 lepers. You remember in chapter 6 and chapter 7, and these lepers who got together, and you remember the story. I may not be able to go back to the full story, but you remember the story that these 4 lepers came together. They realized that they were in a predicament. The whole city was under siege. The city of Samaria was under siege. But these 4 gentlemen realized that they also were in serious need because they were leprous. They had leprosy, which means they had been isolated from the community, and they were hungry. There was no more food available. And they decided and chose among themselves to do something. And out of their conferencing together and out of that desperate situation, there was a glimmer of hope. You remember that last Sunday? Come on, talk to me, congregation. All right? You remember there was a small glimmer of hope. And the only hope they had lay in the enemy's camp. You remember that? Where they came from, it was hopeless. I mean, they couldn't go back. I mean, after all, they were already isolated because they were leprous. But again, even if they were to go back there, there was no food. But there was one little glimmer of hope. And they said, let's go to the enemy. There's food in the enemy's camp. It is the enemy, but at least there's food there. And they chose and decided, let's go there. If we die, we die. In fact, they said, if they kill us, we do what? We will die. So, but then they chose to say, let's act, this was an act of faith for them. And out of hope, they acted by faith. Notice that. Out of hope, they acted by faith. Out of hope, they did what? Acted by faith. And because of that act of faith, God honored that act of faith with every step that they took towards the enemy's camp. What they did not know is that God would use every step and magnify every step such that the enemy began hearing the sound of chariots approaching, the sound of horses approaching, and the enemy decided to take off. By the time these 4 lepers got to the enemy's camp, there was nobody there. And suddenly they were confronted with all this food and with all this silver and gold, and they began to eat. But as they did that, and of course they began to hide some of the silver and gold, they came back together again. Then they say to each other in verse 9, what we are doing is not right. You remember that? And the conference, they said, what we are doing is actually not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. And we discovered last Sunday that when God has blessed you, because we are just but lepers, people. You remember that? That's what we are. We are lepers who have a full stomach. Lepers who have been blessed, because remember we discovered leprosy gave us a very good and type of picture in the scriptures of the effects and the devastation of sin, because the wages of sin is death. And normally in the Bible, leprosy normally will be used to typify and to signify sin. And we discover that we are but lepers who have been blessed. We have discovered there is somewhere there is food where we can be nourished. We have discovered there is a place where there is abundance, silver and gold. But we cannot keep it to ourselves. Like these 4 gentlemen, they decided we cannot keep it to themselves. Why? They said this is a day of... Now, you'll help me preach, people. Alright? This is a day of good news. And they said we must do something about it. Now, notice the Apostle Paul says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 13. He says, and now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of this is love. Notice, he said, now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of this is what? Is love. In other words, for these 4 lepers, going back to that story, they had a little hope. They acted by faith. But there was one more component that was left. The component of love. Are you with me? Now, they could have chosen. By the way, remember, they have all this food. They had all the silver, the gold, the horses, everything was at their disposal. They could have said, listen, by the way, every man for himself and God for all of us. They could have said, listen, we have already been banished from the city. Those people have refused to help us. We have been isolated. I mean, what are the sort? They could have said that, isn't it? They could have said, it is none of our business. In fact, we are isolated anyway. They could have said, let the people earlier, because remember the city was under siege. They could have said, it is none of my business. I don't have to worry about them. I mean, let them find help another way. For us, let's just enjoy the abundance and the goodness of the Lord. But they said it is not good. What we are doing is not, because today is a day of good news, and they decided to act in love. Because now, what they did when they went back to the city to announce to the city that, listen, we went to the enemy's camp, we found the enemy had deserted the whole camp, there is food there, there is abundance. What were they doing? They were acting in love. Why? Because faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of this is what? Is love. In other words, for us, we came to Christ by faith. He has given us hope. He has provided for our needs. We have found a place where we can find nourishment. But our experience is not complete until we act in love. And how do we act in love? We must go and tell the world. We must go and tell our neighbors, listen, you don't have to starve. We have found a place where you can find something to eat. And that is why it is important for us. Yesterday, as we went to Dagoretti and treating those people we didn't even know. We did not go there and say only Christians. In fact, Pastor Dong was telling us that we even had Muslims coming in there. But as we were touching them physically, we were also sharing with them the love of Christ, isn't it? We're saying, did we have to go there? No. But we say we want to act in love. What we have discovered is too good for us to keep to ourselves. Are you with me? And that is why we're challenging you in this month. You cannot keep it to yourself. The world is starving. People are hungry. Let me tell you, do not let the affluence of this world and the monies and people looking good and dressing well, do not let that fool you. You can find people who are really dressed well, but yet they are still lost spiritually. They may look like they have big cars and living in big homes, but they are still miserable. Because until you find Christ, oh come on, can I help me preach this afternoon? Until you have found the Lord, it doesn't matter how much money you have. How many of you know that for sure? You can have all the money, all the affluence. Do you realize that people even in Hollywood are still committing suicide? Why? Is it because they don't have money? They have money, but they are still lost. They still need us to go out and tell them, listen, you don't have to do that. We have found a place where you can find nourishment. We have found a Savior who also loves you. Because until they find the Lord, they will always be lost. They are still lost. So these 4 lepers demonstrate to us love. Friends, there is power in love. Tell your neighbor, there is power in love.